Under the golden lights of the mansion, laughter and music filled the air. The billionaire's party was not just any gathering. It was a show of power. Guests from all corners of high society were there. Dressed in expensive clothes and sparkling jewelry, they sipped wine, whispered about deals worth millions, and praised the host who had brought them all together. For him, this was not about friendship. It was about proving once again that he was at the top. The mansion itself looked like a palace. The marble floor reflected the chandeliers above. Every corner glittered. A red carpet stretched from the grand entrance to the main hall, where the piano stood like a jewel waiting to be touched. Servants walked quickly but quietly, carrying trays of food and drinks, making sure no glass stayed empty. No detail was left undone, for the billionaire loved nothing more than perfection when showing off his wealth. Among the many shining faces, one girl stood out. Not because she was beautiful in diamonds or dressed like the others, but because she was so different. She was there by accident, not by choice. She had come only to help her relative, who worked at the mansion as a part-time caterer. She wore a simple dress, one she had used many times before. It was clean and neat, but in a room full of luxury. It looked plain. At first, nobody noticed her. She stayed near the walls, quiet and observant. She watched the men speak loudly about their businesses, their cars, and their travels. She watched the women compare jewels and whisper who was wearing fake and who was not. It was a world so far away from her own. Yet slowly people began to notice her silence. They noticed her dress, her shoes that had lost their shine, her simple hairstyle. She was different, and in that room different meant something to talk about. A group of guests whispered and chuckled behind crystal glasses. One leaned closer to the other and asked who had allowed such a girl into the hall. Another shrugged and smirked, saying she must have slipped in or been brought in by mistake. Soon enough, the whispers grew, reaching ears that enjoyed gossip more than music. Every smile in her direction carried a hidden laugh. Every glance held judgment. The girl felt it. She felt the eyes, the small laughs, the way some people moved away from her as if her plainness could stain their shining clothes. She kept her head low, wishing she could disappear into the walls. She told herself she would leave soon, once her relative was done. But inside her chest, her heart beat faster. She felt the sting of being unwanted, though she had done nothing wrong. The billionaire walked into the room like a king inspecting his court. His suit was sharp, his shoes shined brighter than the floor, and his smile carried both charm and pride. Wherever he stepped, people moved aside, making way as if he were royalty. He shook hands, clapped shoulders, and laughed loudly, reminding everyone that he was the center. He had built his empire with cleverness and cruelty, and tonight he wanted everyone to remember it. When his eyes fell on the girl, his steps slowed. He noticed her because she did not fit the picture he had painted of his perfect evening. She was like a mark on a flawless painting, small but impossible to ignore. Instead of asking who she was, he smiled to himself. To him, she was not just a guest, she was an opportunity to show once again that power was his, and anyone who dared stand different in his world would be reminded of their place. The music softened as the pianist finished a piece. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed. But the billionaire's mind was already planning. He watched the girl from across the room, her quiet posture, her nervous glances. She did not belong here, and he wanted everyone to know it. His lips curled in amusement. Tonight was his stage, and she was about to be a part of his performance. The girl, unaware of the storm coming her way, stood silently, wishing only for the night to end. She had no idea that soon, in this room filled with diamonds and laughter, all eyes would fall on her, and her life would change forever. The billionaire loved moments like these. For him, life was a stage, and he was always the main actor. Whenever he entered a room, he expected the spotlight to follow him. He was a man who had climbed from nothing to riches, but with every success his pride had grown sharper. He no longer saw people as equals, he saw them as tools, trophies, or obstacles to crush at the party. He moved among the guests with a smile that looked warm but carried no real kindness. Every handshake was a performance, every laugh carefully measured. When someone praised his mansion, he nodded as if it were only natural. When another praised his business empire, he accepted it like a king receiving tribute. Inside, he thought to himself, "Of course they admire me, who wouldn't?" He enjoyed little games of power sometimes. He would invite someone to speak, only to interrupt them with a louder story of his own. Other times, he would ask someone a question about their business and then cleverly expose a weakness. making the person shrink with embarrassment. The crowd always laughed, because no one wanted to be the next target. This was his way of reminding them all that he was the sharpest mind in the room. When his gaze landed on the girl near the wall, his heart quickened with amusement. She was too plain, too simple for his golden hall. Her dress told him she had no place among the wealthy. Her shy posture told him she had no confidence to defend herself. To him she looked like prey, an easy choice for his next game. He did not wonder who she was or why she was there. For him, her story did not matter. What mattered was the chance to entertain himself and his circle. He turned to his closest friends, men and women who shared his hunger for superiority. He whispered something about the girl and their eyes followed his. They chuckled, already expecting a show. These friends had watched him humiliate others before. They had seen him cut down proud businessmen with a single remark. They had watched him mock singers, artists, and even waiters if he felt bored. To them, this was nothing new, but always entertaining. The girl noticed their stares. She shifted uncomfortably, lowering her eyes. Her heart told her something unpleasant was coming. She wanted to slip away, but her relative was still working, and she had promised to wait, so she stood quietly, hoping the powerful man would ignore her. But the billionaire did not ignore. He saw her silence as weakness. He mistook her modesty for fear. In his mind, the plan was already forming. What better way to make my guests laugh than to push this little bird into the fire? He thought. She will stumble, and they will see how small she truly is. His ego swelled with the idea. His friends leaned closer. Whispering their guesses, one said, "Will you ask her to dance?" Another joked, "Maybe she should give a speech about business." The billionaire shook his head with a grin. His eyes flicked toward the grand piano standing proudly in the center of the hall. It was a beautiful instrument, polished and shining, but feared by many who could not play. He thought of the girl sitting there, fumbling, striking the wrong notes, and making the hall roar with laughter. The very thought pleased him. He could already imagine the embarrassment on her face, the nervous trembling of her hands, the way people would mock her afterwards, and when that happened, he would stand there smiling, appearing generous, pretending he had only been curious. In truth, he would be the winner of the game. His pride would grow and the story would spread. How the billionaire turned a plain stranger into the joke of the night. Around him, his guests sensed the moment approaching. They had seen this sparkle in his eyes before. Some waited eagerly, ready to laugh at the girl's expense. Others felt a small pinch of pity for her, but none would stop him. No one ever did, because to stand against him was to invite his wrath. The billionaire adjusted his cufflinks, took a sip of wine, and began walking slowly toward her. Each step felt heavy in the silence of her mind. Though the music and laughter around her continued, she felt his presence before he reached her. She knew eyes were following him, following her, and the distance between them shrank too quickly. When he finally stopped before her, the room seemed to pause. Guests leaned closer, pretending to sip their drinks but not missing a word. His smile was wide, but his eyes were sharp. He spoke to her with the sweetness of honey but the sting of poison beneath. She looked up, startled, caught between politeness and fear. The billionaire's voice carried across the room as he asked her the first question. It sounded kind to outsiders, but those who knew him could hear the trap forming. He was about to begin a game, one he believed only he could win. His pride stood tall, and his ego whispered that this girl, this simple stranger, was about to become his next victim. The hall was alive with chatter and music. Yet when the billionaire stopped near the girl, a strange silence slowly crept into the air. People leaned closer, their laughter fading as they sensed something about to happen. The girl kept her head slightly lowered, wishing not to draw attention. But attention was already pouring onto her like a spotlight she could not escape. The billionaire's smile widened, but behind that smile was a plan. He gestured toward the grand piano in the center of the room. Its surface shone under the chandelier lights, waiting silently. "Tell me," he said in a voice loud enough for others to hear, "do you play the piano?" His words sounded like a question, but his tone carried amusement as though the answer hardly mattered. The girl froze, her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. She felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Some looked curious, some looked eager for drama, and some smirked. Already expecting failure, she shook her head slightly, whispering that she did not. But the billionaire leaned closer, pretending not to hear. He repeated the question, this time louder. His voice rolled through the hall, drawing even more ears into the moment. Whispers began. A woman in a diamond necklace covered her smile with her hand. "She cannot possibly play," someone murmured. Another laughed softly. "This will be fun." The crowd was not cruel by nature, but in that glittering world, they often followed the mood set by their host, and the host was already building a game for their amusement. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say no firmly, to refuse, but the billionaire's presence felt heavy. It was as if his wealth and power alone pressed down on her shoulders. Her throat tightened. She glanced at the piano, its polished keys looking both inviting and terrifying. She could not imagine walking across the floor, sitting on that bench and letting everyone stare. The billionaire's smirk deepened. He tapped the glass in his hand and said, "Come, just a little tune, surely you know something. Everyone knows something." His words echoed like a command wrapped in politeness. The guests chuckled, nodding in agreement. Some clapped lightly as if encouraging her, but their eyes glittered with anticipation of her stumbling. The girl took a step back, shaking her head again. But the billionaire moved slightly forward, blocking her retreat. He gestured with his hand toward the piano. His voice softened now, dripping with fake kindness. "Don't be shy. We are all friends here." But the sharpness in his gaze told her there was no escape. Her relative, busy serving drinks at the far end, noticed her discomfort but could not reach her quickly. The girl felt alone, trapped in a cage of golden laughter and polished shoes. She swallowed hard, her palms sweating. She whispered that she truly could not, but the billionaire chuckled. Turning to the crowd, "She says she cannot, but I think she only hides her talent, shall we see?" The hall erupted with cheers and claps. Not loud, but enough to pressure her. She looked around. Faces blurred into one mocking crowd. If she refused again, it would not just be the billionaire laughing at her, it would be everyone. They would talk about it long after the party. How a simple girl was too afraid even to touch the keys. Slowly, as though her feet were no longer her own, she moved toward the piano. Each step sounded loud in her ears, louder than the music that had stopped. Her legs trembled, her hands shook, and her breath came quick. The guests watched with sharp eyes, whispering bets about how quickly she would fail. When she finally reached the piano, the polished wood reflected her nervous face. She sat on the bench, her knees stiff. Her fingers hovering above the keys, the room went utterly quiet. So quiet she could hear the ticking of a distant clock. The billionaire folded his arms, standing proudly. His friends exchanged knowing smiles, already tasting victory for him. The girl closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside her. She remembered the cruel stares, the mocking smiles, and the billionaire's sharp gaze. She wanted to run, but running would only give them more reason to laugh. She wanted to speak, but her voice would break, and so she stayed, her fingers trembling above the keys. The billionaire cleared his throat loudly. "Well?" he said, his voice carrying amusement. The crowd chuckled again, leaning forward, waiting for the stumble, waiting for the mistake. For them it was entertainment. For him it was proof of his power. For her it was a nightmare. The moment stretched on like eternity. The girl's heart raced faster, but deep inside her something stirred, a small spark that had been hidden. The piano was not a stranger to her fingers, though no one in the room knew it yet. For years, she had practiced quietly in places no one noticed, in corners where no one cared. She had never performed before such a crowd, but the music had always been her companion. And in that moment of silence, with the weight of the entire hall pressing on her, she had to decide. Would she remain the victim of his game, or would she let her true self speak through the keys? She drew a deep breath, lowered her trembling fingers onto the piano, and pressed the first note. The sound rang out clear and soft, cutting through the mocking silence like the very first word of a story no one expected to hear. The girl's hands hovered above the piano keys, and for a moment she thought about standing up and leaving. Her heart told her she did not belong there, not in front of so many glittering eyes that carried both curiosity and cruelty. She could feel her breath quicken, her chest rising and falling as if the very air in the hall had grown heavy. She had said no before, she had shaken her head, but the billionaire's voice still echoed in her ears, commanding and mocking at the same time. Her first instinct was to escape, to walk away from the piano and return to the safety of the wall where she had stood earlier, but the thought of walking away under so many stares burned her. They would laugh, whisper, and carry the story long after the night was over. They would say, "She was too weak to even try." The billionaire would smirk and tell the tale again and again at future parties, using her as an example of his power. That thought weighed heavily on her. Her palms were wet with sweat, and she rubbed them softly on her dress. The fabric was old but comforting. It reminded her of home, of simple days where no one judged her for what she wore. Her mind swirled with doubt, but somewhere deep inside a small voice whispered, "Don't give them what they want." That voice was quiet, but it was enough to make her stay seated. The billionaire leaned forward slightly, his lips curling into a smile that looked kind to outsiders but sharp to her. "Take your time," he said. His words carried no patience, only challenge. His friends chuckled softly, waiting like hunters around a trapped bird. The girl knew there was no easy way out. If she refused now, she would be humiliated. If she tried and failed, she would still be humiliated. Both paths looked dark, and yet another thought struck her. What if she did not fail? What if, just once, she allowed the music she had hidden for so long to flow freely? She had practiced in secret, late at night when the world was quiet. She had played old borrowed instruments, nothing like this shining piano. The thought of touching these perfect keys filled her with both fear and excitement. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the faces, shutting out the laughter she expected. She imagined herself back in those quiet moments, when the world outside did not matter, when it was only her and the music. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, letting the air carry away some of her fear. Her shoulders straightened slightly, though her hands still trembled. The guests leaned forward in their seats, some pretending to sip their drinks, others holding their breath in anticipation. They had seen many people play before, professional musicians hired for entertainment. But this was different. This was not about music to them. It was about a girl standing against the pride of a billionaire. The girl opened her eyes again and let her fingers touch the keys. They felt cool, smooth, and almost alive beneath her skin. The first note she pressed was soft like a whisper. It floated into the room and hung in the silence. She expected laughter, expected someone to sneer. But the room stayed quiet, waiting. The billionaire's smile faltered slightly. Only for a second he had expected her to stumble immediately, to strike the wrong note and prove his point. But the sound, though small, was clean. He crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes. His pride told him she would still fail. But deep inside, a tiny seed of doubt was planted. The girl's heart beat faster. But with each second, her fear shifted into something else. Her hands moved to another key, then another. The sound grew clearer, her touch lighter. She remembered the hours she had spent practicing alone, her fingers finding comfort in the rhythm. She remembered the way music had always lifted her from sadness, how it had been her secret escape. Still, she hesitated between notes. Each second felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, but the more she played, the more the cliff felt like a stage she could stand on. The whispers in the room quieted even further. Guests exchanged looks, surprised that the expected mistake had not yet come. The billionaire tilted his head, trying to read her face, but her eyes were on the keys. Her lips were pressed together, her entire focus on the instrument. The hall was now caught in an odd tension. The crowd wanted to laugh, but the music pulled them into silence, and in that silence the girl found strength. The fear that had once chained her began to loosen. She realized she had nothing left to lose. If she failed, they would mock her. But if she succeeded, even for a few minutes, she would turn their game against them. Her fingers grew steadier. She pressed a series of notes that blended together, the beginning of a melody she had practiced in secret many times before, a melody filled with gentle rises and falls. Like a voice telling a story, the hall listened, perhaps not fully realizing it yet, but already caught in the spell of her music. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably, his smirk weaker now. He had wanted a quick humiliation, but instead the game was stretching into something else. He glanced at his friends, but even they looked unsure now, caught between waiting for her mistake and admitting they were impressed. The girl played on, her face calm though her heart still raced in that moment. She was no longer the outsider in a plain dress, no longer the quiet figure at the edge of the room. She was the center, not because the billionaire had chosen her, but because the music demanded it. And though she had not yet finished, though her melody had only begun, something inside her whispered that this night would not end the way the billionaire had imagined. Her reluctant acceptance had turned into the first step of something greater, something no one in the room would ever forget. The girl sat on the piano bench with her back straight but her hands trembling. The grand instrument in front of her looked both like a friend and an enemy. Its polished surface reflected her nervous face, her wide eyes and the faint shine of sweat on her forehead. She took another slow breath, trying to steady herself. Around her, the air felt heavy, filled with judgment and curiosity. Every second of silence made the pressure worse, as though the walls of the mansion themselves were leaning closer. Then at last her fingers pressed down on the first key. A soft note slipped into the air. Gentle like a whisper, it floated through the hall, so light that many leaned forward to catch it. The sound was not clumsy. It was not broken. It was delicate, pure, and filled with care. Some of the guests tilted their heads in surprise, their lips, which had been ready to curl into mocking smiles, paused instead. Her second note followed. Then a third. Slowly, a small rhythm began to form. Her fingers shook less now because the keys felt familiar. Each touch reminded her of the long nights she had spent practicing alone. She had played music when no one else listened. She had played when she was sad, when she was hopeful, and when she wanted to escape the noise of the world. But here, in this glittering hall filled with strangers, the music was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who listened. The laughter that had filled the mansion minutes before melted into silence. The clinking of glasses stopped, the whispers froze. Every guest turned their eyes and ears toward her. The mocking energy in the room slowly began to dissolve. At first they had expected mistakes. They waited for her to stumble, to strike the wrong key, to prove she was unworthy. Yet the melody carried on, fragile but steady. Like the opening lines of a story, it caught their attention. It was not grand or showy, it was simple, but that simplicity touched something real. The billionaire stood with his arms crossed, his smirk thin but still present. He told himself it was only the beginning, that soon she would falter. His pride demanded it. He could not imagine her truly succeeding. But in his chest, a faint unease began to grow, one he quickly pushed down. The girl did not notice his stare. For the first time that night, she was no longer thinking about the crowd. She was not thinking about her plain dress, or the whispers, or even the billionaire. She thought only about the music. Each note was like a heartbeat pushing away her fear. She could almost hear her younger self practicing in secret, reminding her that music had always been her strength. Her melody grew a little louder, more confident. The guests exchanged quick glances. Unsure of what they were hearing, some of them leaned back. Caught between surprise and admiration, one whispered softly, "She can play." Another nodded without speaking. Their eyes, once filled with amusement, now showed the first flicker of respect. The girl's fingers danced slowly across the keys. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. Her fear had not vanished, but it was shrinking with every passing second. The music gave her courage. The notes rose and fell like waves, each one smooth and careful. The hall seemed to breathe with her rhythm. Children in the crowd, restless earlier, grew quiet. Their parents noticed but did not move. They, too, were caught in the unexpected spell of her song. The servants who had been moving trays around the room stopped at the edges, drawn in by the sound. It was no longer just a performance forced on a nervous girl. It was becoming something deeper. The billionaire's friends, who had been ready to laugh, began shifting in their seats. They did not clap yet, they did not speak, but their expressions betrayed them. They were no longer watching a joke. They were watching something they had not expected. And though they would never admit it aloud, some of them felt a sting of shame for having wanted her to fail. The girl pressed another chord, stronger this time. Her eyes lifted slightly from the keys just for a second. She saw the stillness in the crowd, the way people leaned forward. Their attention caught. It startled her. But it also gave her a strange comfort. They were not laughing. They were listening, truly listening. Her lips curved just slightly, the faintest smile. She turned back to the keys and continued, letting her fingers tell the story she had never spoken aloud. She played the joy she once felt when discovering music, the loneliness she had carried in silence, the hope that had always lived inside her despite the hardships. Each note was not just sound, it was emotion. It was her soul translated into music. The hall, once loud with arrogance and pride, had transformed for those few minutes. Wealth and power meant nothing. Diamonds and gold lost their shine against the glow of her melody. People who had come to see the billionaire's strength now saw something stronger. The quiet courage of a girl who had been underestimated. Still, the billionaire tried to hold his pride. He shifted his stance, tightening his jaw. He told himself the applause, if it came, would fade. He told himself she was still only a girl, that her music meant nothing in the world of power. But no matter how much he tried to deny it, he could not ignore the feeling in the room. The crowd was no longer his. The spotlight had shifted. The girl's hand slowed, bringing the melody to a gentle pause. The final note lingered in the air like the last word of a poem. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not mocking silence. It was the silence of hearts that had been touched. She lifted her fingers slowly. Resting them in her lap, her breath came quickly, but her eyes looked calmer than before. For the first time all night, she felt a quiet strength rise inside her. She had not only played, she had spoken, and though the billionaire had forced her into that seat, it was she who now held the room. The music grew richer with every passing second. At first the girl's hands had trembled, but now they glided over the keys with grace. The melody rose like sunlight breaking through clouds. It filled the great hall not just with sound but with emotion. The guests who had been whispering earlier were silent now. Their eyes followed her fingers, their hearts followed the rhythm. What began as soft notes had transformed into something powerful. The piano seemed alive under her touch. It was no longer just wood and strings, it was a voice. Her voice. She poured into the music everything she had ever carried inside her. The sadness of being overlooked, the joy of small victories, the quiet strength she had built in solitude. The guests felt it even if they could not explain it. Some leaned back in their seats, breathing slowly as the melody wrapped around them. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, forgetting their glasses of wine. Even the servants at the edges of the hall stopped moving, their trays still in their hands. The air itself seemed to listen. The billionaire stood frozen. His smirk had vanished completely. His chest tightened with something he had not expected. Doubt. He had thought she would stumble. He had thought the hall would laugh. But instead, the hall was enchanted. Every note she played was like a thread weaving a spell over his guests, and he, the proud host, was powerless to break it. The girl, however, was no longer thinking about him. She had forgotten the stares, forgotten the laughter she had feared. For her, there was only the piano and the story it allowed her to tell. She played a melody she had carried for years, a piece that had lived in her heart when no one else cared to listen. Each rise and fall of the music matched the rise and fall of her spirit. She remembered the nights she had practiced alone, when her fingers ached but she pressed on. She remembered the tears that had fallen onto worn-out keys of borrowed instruments. She remembered the dreams she had never dared to speak. And now all of it flowed out freely. The notes were not perfect, but they were alive, filled with truth. The audience began to feel something they had not expected at a wealthy man's party: emotion. A woman in pearls dabbed her eyes quietly with a handkerchief. A man who had laughed earlier now sat still. His face softened. Even the children in the hall sat motionless, as if the music had reached into their small hearts too. The melody climbed higher, brighter. Her hands no longer shook. They flew across the keys as if they had been waiting for this very moment. It was as though the girl had been transformed before their eyes. No longer the plain, quiet figure by the wall. She was now the center of the hall, a star shining brighter than the chandeliers above. And the billionaire felt it most. His pride burned, his jaw clenched. He could not bear that his plan had turned against him. Instead of humiliating her, he had handed her the stage. He had given her the very spotlight he craved for himself. The guests were not watching him anymore. They were not admiring his mansion or his wealth. They were watching her inside him. Anger and disbelief battled. He wanted to interrupt, to stop her, but he could not. To do so would expose his cruelty to everyone. And so he stood still, a prisoner of the very game he had created. The more she played, the smaller he felt. His pride, once towering, was crumbling note by note. The girl, lost in her music, did not see his struggle. Her eyes were half closed, her face calm. She was no longer the nervous outsider. She was a musician, an artist. Her every movement was confident, graceful. Her music told a story of resilience, of beauty found in unexpected places. It told the truth of her spirit, something no wealth could buy. The guests began to shift in their seats, not with restlessness but with awe. Their applause had not yet begun, but it was building in their hearts. They knew they were witnessing something unforgettable, something purer than all the diamonds around them. As the piece reached its height, the music grew faster, stronger. Her fingers raced, the notes like fire dancing through the hall. People gasped softly, not out of mockery but out of amazement. How could someone so young, so plain, play with such passion, such mastery? It was as though the piano itself had been waiting for her all along. Then slowly the music began to soften. The storm of notes calmed into a gentle river. Flowing peacefully, the guests leaned in, not wanting to miss a single sound. The final stretch of her melody was tender, delicate like a soft goodbye. And when at last the final note was pressed, it lingered in the air, hanging like a star refusing to fade. For a moment silence reigned. The hall, once filled with pride and laughter, was now still. Every guest held their breath. Trapped between disbelief and admiration, they had expected a failure, but they had witnessed transformation. They had expected a joke, but they had been given a gift. The girl lifted her hands slowly from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her chest rose and fell with deep breaths. Sweat glistened faintly on her forehead, but her eyes were calm. Her head lifted slightly, not in arrogance but in dignity. She had given her all, and the room had no choice but to receive it. The billionaire's face burned red. His pride, once untouchable, was wounded deeply. He wanted to speak, but words would not come. He wanted to laugh it off, but the silence of the room would not allow it. He had thought himself untouchable, yet a simple girl with music had shaken him more than any rival ever had. The transformation was complete. The girl who had walked in quietly, almost invisible, had risen through her music into something unforgettable. And the billionaire, who had once towered above everyone in arrogance, now stood in the shadow of her brilliance. The last note hung in the air like a star that refused to die. It floated above the hall, soft and powerful at the same time. For a few seconds nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. Nobody clapped or whispered. It was as if the entire room had been frozen in the magic of that sound. The girl sat still, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her chest rising and falling quickly as she caught her breath. Then slowly, the silence cracked. A pair of hands clapped once. Hesitant, then another joined and another soon. The hall was filled with the sound of applause, soft at first, then growing stronger, louder, until it was like thunder rolling across the marble floor. The guests who had expected her to fail were now standing, rising one by one from their seats. Their faces showed shock, admiration, even shame for having doubted her. The girl blinked, her eyes wide. She had not expected this. She had thought perhaps they would ignore her, or laugh politely and turn away. But instead they stood, clapping and cheering, their jeweled hands meeting together, their voices rising in approval. For a moment she did not know if this was real. She felt as if she were dreaming. Her lips trembled, not with fear this time, but with emotion. A small smile appeared, faint but true. She bowed her head slightly, unsure of how to respond to such an overwhelming reaction. Never in her life had she stood before so many important people and received such respect. It was more than applause, it was acknowledgement. The hall that had once seemed like a cage now felt like a stage built just for her. The chandeliers sparkled above her, but they no longer looked like symbols of wealth. They looked like stars shining for her performance. Even the walls, once heavy with judgment, now seemed to echo with the claps of appreciation. The billionaire stood rooted in place. His arms no longer crossed, his smirk completely gone. His eyes darted around the room, watching as his friends and guests gave the girl a standing ovation. He wanted to stop them, to remind them this was his house, his party, but he could not. The applause was too strong. It swallowed his voice before he could even speak. His friends, the very ones who had laughed with him earlier, were now clapping the loudest. Some even smiled warmly toward the girl. Their faces glowed with admiration, not for the billionaire, but for her. They had forgotten him for the first time that night. He had lost his control, his stage and his pride. The girl's relative, who had been serving drinks at the back, stopped and watched with tears in their eyes. They had always known she had a gift, but to see the world recognize it was something beyond dreams. They clapped too, proud and overwhelmed. The applause grew into cheers. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Another cried out, "Magnificent!" The girl lowered her head again, her cheeks warming with a blush. She had never imagined strangers would call her performance magnificent, especially these strangers who lived in a world so far from hers. And then, something even more powerful happened. The crowd, as if moved by the same invisible thread, began to rise higher. Their clapping turned into a rhythm, louder, sharper, until it filled every corner of the mansion. The girl felt her heart swell. She realized this was not pity. This was not politeness, this was real. She stood slowly from the bench, her knees weak. She gave a small bow, her hair falling softly over her face. The applause roared louder, echoing against the high ceiling. It was like waves crashing again and again. The sound wrapped around her, lifting her higher than she had ever felt in that moment. She was no longer the plain girl in a simple dress. She was no longer the outsider clinging to the wall. She was the star of the evening, the memory that every guest would take home with them. They would not talk about the food or the wine or even the grandeur of the mansion. They would talk about her, the girl who played the piano with such heart that she broke the silence of judgment and replaced it with wonder. The billionaire's face burned with shame. He clenched his jaw, but he could not hide the truth. His plan had failed. His pride had been shattered in front of everyone he had wanted to impress. The girl he had meant to humiliate now stood above him, not in wealth, not in power, but in dignity. He forced a smile, trying to mask his anger. But the crowd was not looking at him. They were looking at her. Even his closest allies had turned their backs to him for this moment. Their eyes sparkled not with fear of him, but with admiration for her. The sound of their applause was like a wall shutting him out. The girl stood quietly, still bowing her head in respect.
She did not mock him. She did not gloat.
That was not her way. Her victory was not about him, it was about herself. About proving she was more than what people thought she was. Her strength lay not in crushing others, but in lifting her own spirit through music. As the applause finally began to soften, people kept their eyes on her. Some even walked closer to shake her hand, to thank her. A woman placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered words of praise. The girl nodded shyly, her heart still racing. She felt both small and enormous at the same time. The hall was forever changed, the night had shifted. No longer was it the billionaire's night. It was hers, and though the applause eventually ended, its echo stayed alive in every corner of the mansion, a reminder that true greatness cannot be bought with money, but created with heart. The applause slowly faded, but the weight of it stayed in the air like perfume that refused to vanish. The girl stood by the piano, her eyes lowered, her cheeks warm, and her heart racing. She had expected humiliation, yet she had found dignity. She had expected to be a shadow in the corner, yet she had become the light of the evening for a moment. She closed her eyes and let the memory of the clapping sink into her soul. She knew this was a moment she would carry for the rest of her life. But across the hall, the billionaire stood frozen, his face stiff, his fists tight. His plan had shattered in front of everyone. He had invited the girl to the stage to humiliate her, to remind the crowd of his power. Instead, she had stolen his spotlight and broken his pride. The very people who once looked at him with awe were now looking past him. Their admiration had shifted, and he could feel it like a wound in his chest. He forced a smile, thin and brittle, but his eyes betrayed him. They burned with frustration. His guests did not notice or pretended not to notice his struggle. They were too busy talking about the girl, praising her performance, retelling the magic of her music even minutes after it had ended. It was her name on their lips, her face in their eyes, not his for years. He had ruled every room he entered. His money, his charm, his arrogance. They had always been enough to command attention tonight for the first time. None of that mattered. A girl in a plain dress, with trembling hands and honest music, had done what no rival businessman or critic could ever do. She had humbled him. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably. His pride screamed at him to say something, to take back control, but what could he say? If he mocked her now, he would look cruel and bitter. If he praised her, it would sound false. If he stayed silent, it would only prove that he had been defeated. Every choice felt like a trap, and for the first time, he realized that power could vanish in a moment. The girl, however, did not think about him. She stepped down from the bench quietly. Her movements were gentle, graceful. She bowed her head once more toward the crowd, not demanding their attention but receiving it naturally. People rushed forward, some shook her hand. Others thanked her warmly. A few even asked where she had learned to play. Their words wrapped around her like a soft blanket, reminding her that she was no longer invisible. Her relative came forward too, tears shining in their eyes. They whispered how proud they were, how the girl had shown everyone her true self. The girl nodded softly, her lips curving into a shy smile. She felt lighter than she ever had before. For so long she had hidden her gift, but tonight the world had seen it. and the world had respected it. Meanwhile, the billionaire's friends began to whisper to one another, not about his wealth or his latest deal, but about the girl. They spoke of how rare it was to see such passion, how surprising it was to find such talent in a stranger. Their admiration was honest, and it stung him like salt on a wound. He realized that in a single evening, his carefully built pride had been cracked open. The guests who once laughed at his jokes now laughed without him. The ones who once sought his approval now gave their approval to her. He had been the master of the night, but now he was just a man in the background. The realization cut deep, deeper than any insult ever had. The girl, unaware of the storm inside him, walked with calm steps toward the exit. She did not hurry, she did not boast. She simply carried herself with quiet dignity. Her plain dress still hung around her, but it no longer looked plain to the eyes of the guests. She was clothed in something brighter, respect. As she reached the door, the crowd's whispers followed her. But they were no longer cruel. They were full of admiration, full of awe. Some said she had reminded them what true beauty was. Others said she had given them a gift far greater than all the jewels in the room. She left them not with laughter at her expense, but with a memory they would never forget. The billionaire remained by the piano, his mind swirling. He replayed the night in his head and saw his mistake again and again. He had underestimated her. He had believed that wealth could control every moment, but she had proven him wrong. She had shown that talent, heart, and courage could rise above money and pride. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. For the first time he felt small in his own mansion, surrounded by his own guests, his empire, his riches. His arrogance, none of it had saved him from this defeat. The girl had walked out with nothing in her hands but everything in her spirit, and he, with all his fortune, felt empty. The night ended, but the story did not. The guests left with excitement in their voices, speaking not of the billionaire's wealth, but of the girl's music. They carried her memory into the world beyond those walls. Spreading it like a flame, the billionaire knew it. And the knowledge stung him deeply. The girl, as she stepped into the cool night air, lifted her head to the stars. She felt free. She had faced humiliation and turned it into triumph. She had been forced into the spotlight, but she had owned it. Her music had spoken louder than words, louder than pride, and though she had left quietly, she had left victorious. The billionaire stayed inside, alone in a hall that now felt too large, too quiet. His pride was broken, and he knew it. The memory of her music echoed in his mind, reminding him that for all his power he had been defeated by something pure, simple and true. And so the night ended, not with his laughter, not with his victory, but with hers. A girl who had nothing had taken everything, and a man who had everything had been left with nothing but silence.